Migration is about refugees and asylum seekers, but it's also about all sorts of other modern-day nomads too. A new book titled The New Nomads: How the Migration Revolution is Making the World a Better Place shows how people from everywhere are finding opportunities everywhere. For more, I'm joined by author Felix Marquardt. Felix, thank you so much for your time. Let's talk about what inspired you to write this book.
Very good to be with you indeed. Thank you very much for having me. When we speak about migration, very much we tend to be speaking actually about immigration, which is a bit like talking about breathing and always talking about inspiring and never talking about expiration. And so this book is about what happens. It's about all the processes, all the virtues that come from leaving home. When you leave home, it's only when you leave home that you really understand where you're coming from. It's only when you leave home that you are able to understand the society you come from. It's only when you leave home that you really understand where you want to go. And this is what I wanted to focus on in a world where 99% of books on migration are actually about immigration.
What was the process of putting the book together? Because I find it quite interesting, and I loved the way you tied in your story and your family's story into the book.
Well, it was definitely a journey. I think it's quite fitting that a book called The New Nomads ended up being such an interesting journey in itself. When I got my book deal, I thought that the process of writing the book would take me just a few months. And what happened instead is that instead of 4 months, it took me 4 years to write. I would say that when I started writing the book, I had a very idealized view of migration. I only saw the good sides of it. And what slowly but surely I discovered is that in a world of increasing inequality, mobility is the ultimate status symbol. And oftentimes people have views on migration that are determined by how mobile they are themselves. Coming from a family of migrants with 10 different nationalities in the family, it was very interesting for me to realize that much of my open-mindedness regarding migration was not the fruit of superior moral fiber, but rather just a factor of the fact that I had been moving around and my whole family has been moving around for decades.
Speaking about that open-mindedness rather on migration, how have your acquaintances and even on the research that you've gone through, how are we defining migration? Because some people think of it as, a sad word where they take pity on you because you are a migrant. So when you were having that conversation with your friends about the book, how were they thinking about migration?
Well, it's very interesting because we tend to see migrants and refugees either, depending on our politics, we tend to be either skeptical or reserved or quite against the phenomenon of migration. Or if we are more progressive, we tend to look on migrants and refugees with pity, thinking, poor things. And in both cases, what's interesting about both is that in both cases, we tend to be dehumanizing migrants. Today's refugee can be tomorrow's very successful entrepreneur. Yesterday's digital nomad can find himself in a very, very complicated situation in a different country. So what it allowed me to see is the humanity behind all these generalizations that we tend to make about migration, migrants, and refugees.
So let's talk about chapter 6, because it's titled Refugees and Communities, and I found that story quite interesting. How do we strike the balance between the practical concerns around refugees and also the humanity aspect of refugees? As one author said to me earlier this year, no one chooses to be a refugee.
No, I think there are really, really good reasons to make distinctions between forced migrants, which is the definition of a refugee, and migrants who decide to move around by choice. Although, some will say, the choice was not entirely clear, but basically there are very good reasons for that, if only because most countries in the world have a certain number of people that they're willing to welcome in case of, because they are refugees, because they are seeking political asylum, fleeing war, or fleeing extreme poverty. So there should be a nuance between migrants by choice and forced migrants. But as we welcome refugees, as we welcome migrants in our societies, we often tend to group them among themselves and to not foster immersion within the broader population. And the result is that they don't play the key role, they don't benefit from community the way that they might, and they do not get integrated the way that they might. And so oftentimes the result is that what we do in the process is create more feelings of estrangement between local communities, which are craving actually newcomers and who often feel sidelined by people in urban centers, and refugees who are really in need of this immersion into community. One of the interesting things about the word nomad is that our sort of high velocity our modern obsession for high velocity mobility has us focus entirely on the mobility aspect of the nomad. But the word nomad comes from the Greek nomos, which means the pasture. So the nomad is profoundly a local creature. It's a creature of community. It's a creature that is focused very much on its surroundings. And so, contrary to what many of us think when we think of nomadism, the nomad is an expert of the local or trying to become an expert of the local. And far too often, we are letting refugees and migrants become increasingly alienated while locals continue to feel like migrants and refugees might be a threat because they don't know any.
Yeah.
So creating that connection is really, really important. And when you do it, you obtain really surprising results. You get Trump supporters who can actually be very warm to refugees. You can, not that I'm saying that that is the rule, certainly, but some very interesting things happen, and we're not going there enough.